This is Metabolic Mastery, a KORR Medical Technologies podcast dedicated to advancing knowledge and practice in metabolic testing. Welcome to Metabolic Mastery, brought to you by KORR Medical Technologies. I'm Dr. Marc Humbert, and this is my co-host, Dr. Cameron Garber. And today we're going to be talking about testing mode. So one question that we get a lot of times is, what should I test people on? Should I do bike, treadmill? We've had people test on like ski ergs, rower ergs, ellipticals, all sorts of things.
Awesome. Yeah, last week I did a test in an underwater treadmill.
That's true. That was cool. That was kind of fun. And so kind of what are the considerations? Why would I choose one mode versus the other? What changes if I do that? How does that affect heart rate zones? All those are questions that we commonly get.
Yeah. Oh, and protocol. What's the protocol with each device, and how should we do that?
Yeah. So while traditional testing, like when you look in the research, is usually like treadmill or bike, people ask, the natural question is, which one is better, right? And neither is universally better. It's just, what are you trying to test? As we always say, test what you intend to measure.
That's what.
And so, again, and that applies to all the different testing modes. And so we want to know, well, first, like, what do we want to know, right? What are we looking to find out? Are we looking for VO2 max on treadmill? Are we looking for VO2 max on bike? Are we looking for any of those things? We first have to know what we're looking for, so then we can design the protocol. We can choose the right modality. Second, we want to know what the person trains for, or what mode of exercise they're planning on doing. So if they haven't been doing cardio for a while, they're like, oh, you know what? I really used to love cycling. I just bought a bike. I'm going to get back into that. Okay, well, it's probably want to do a cycle test for that. And then there's also considerations like safety. You know, for older adults, you might choose a different mode. People with orthopedic issues, or certain people, like certain modes aren't available. And so that's where like even arm ergometry is useful. And then, you know, are you designing the test for general fitness, or is this going to be more sport specific?
Yeah. Well, so we kind of have this framework of going through that cascade of questions that Marc just talked about, that I think is, we plan on talking about it at the end, but I actually think to go over that right now makes a lot of sense, because it really does follow what Marc just said. So before starting the test, we kind of have to ask ourselves, what am I trying to measure? Like, is this for sports performance? Is this for general fitness and wellness? Is this, you know, what am I really looking to get? Do I need a solid zone 2 so that I can make accurate exercise prescriptions for somebody looking to lose weight or to improve performance? Am I looking for those upper zones because this is a highly trained athlete that I want to really differentiate their high-end training? So I need that zone 4, zone 5, so I can make sure they're pushing hard enough. And we always want to get zone 2 for those athletes as well, to make sure they're not pushing too hard in their regular training. You know, what is it that I'm trying to measure? And then what mode does that person train in? If it's a runner, obviously a treadmill. If it's a triathlete, we want to go bike and treadmill. If it's somebody that does ski touring, so, you know, backcountry skiing type stuff, we'd probably want to be more on a ski erg. So that all of those things can really help us dial that in. And then what will I use the result for? Is this baseline testing? Is this something where I'm going to use this for their specific exercise prescription? What really is the idea behind why I'm using the result? The next question is, in this framework, is what can they safely and competently perform? That always plays a factor. And then how can I make the setup as repeatable as possible so that I can retest later and make sure I'm comparing apples to apples? So I think that framework really does help set kind of the beginning of the conversation as well. We'll revisit it later and go through that, but I think just laying that out there a little bit is helpful of helping us frame the idea of testing what we intend to measure. Sorry, I jumped ahead, but
no, I think that's such an important point, because if we don't have those questions right, then we're not going to necessarily choose the right test for that person for what we're trying to measure. And so that ends up being really important, because it's going to change the test design, the test protocol. So again, if we're like, oh, I just really want to dial in their zone 2, that's where we might do a long form test, or kind of like a metabolic efficiency test, where we're just zooming in on that. Or, oh, I just only care about VO2 max. I just want to push them the hardest and the quickest that I can. And so maybe that's going to be a very short ramp test, and we're just trying to get to exhaustion as quickly as possible.
And both of those are valid, just depending on what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
But a VO2 max test where you push it really hard and get that VO2 max very quickly, it's probably not going to be your best test for zoning or for getting their fat max point and really dialing in that zone 2 and things like that. So those individual, characteristics of each test help us decide which kind of test we want to do. If we want to look at fatigue resistance, we probably should go more than 10 to 12 minutes, and so depending on what we're looking at really does help us frame which type of test we're doing. But the mode of testing that we're doing, or the device of testing that we're doing, that really makes a big difference. Because each test or each exercise modality uses very different muscle sets, having them test really according to their body is so important. So we do get asked that question, like Mark said, which is better, bike or treadmill? I get asked that every single day. So yesterday, in fact, I was asked that question by on two different calls. They were like, well, we currently have a bike. Which is better, bike or treadmill? Was the one. And then the other is, we were looking at buying some equipment, which is better, bike or treadmill? And no one is better. It just depends, who are you working with? Are you working with cyclists? Then a bike test is better. Are you working with people the overwhelming majority of the people who you're working with are going to be using walking as their primary mode of exercise? So if you work mostly with older adults, which both of these groups worked with people in their 40s plus, up to 80.
Is that older adults now?
Well, it's becoming, I'm on the bullet train now that I'm 40 to older adult. But that's okay, because I can stay fit and healthy and active. But if their concern was, if I've got an 80-year-old on the treadmill, is that going to be unsafe? I'd rather do a bike test because they can't fall off the bike. Well, I guess they technically can, but a lot harder.
Yeah.
And so I understand that concern. At the same time, you're taking somebody that probably hasn't biked in 40 years and putting them on a bike, and you're probably testing their leg power more than you're testing their cardiovascular functioning, because they're not conditioned to that activity. And so same thing could be said, though, with like a Bruce protocol on the treadmill, where you take that same 80-year-old and start at a 10% grade. When was the last time they walked briskly up a 10% grade?
When was the last time they walked briskly up like a 2% grade?
Yeah. And so you really have to think, man, we're pushing them in a way that they haven't been pushed for a while. Are we really testing their cardiovascular system, or are we testing their muscle capacity for a short duration? And so we're not really getting as accurate of a result of what their heart and lungs are able to do, because we wore out their legs, or we made them hold on because of safety. And now we're burning fewer calories because they're not having to do the balance component, and it affects the overall outcome of the test. And so those considerations make it a big deal. So that was my question to them: is most of your people, are they going to be exercising with overground walking as their primary mode of exercise? And well, yeah, probably so. That's probably what they're going to do. Then it would probably be best to test what you intend to measure, which is what are their zones, what's their output, what's their function in overground walking.
Yeah.
So treadmill is going to mimic that better than any other mode of exercise, and use the same muscle groups that they will be using. And so those results are going to be more applicable to that, and we can actually make inferences there. Whereas a bike test, their heart rate zones are going to be very different. Their VO2 max, the VO2 max for a bike is actually less. We would expect a lower number than the VO2 max for a treadmill test. The reason being is, on a bike, you're using quads and hams only. right? You don't really use many other muscle groups.
Yeah.
Whereas on a treadmill, we're using calves, feet muscles, feet and hip stabilizers. We're using quads and glutes.
Yeah.
Um,
Even arms as well.
yeah, arms. We're using our trunk to stabilize and have posture and balance. And so it's much more of a total body activity. And so we see a lot more, a higher VO2 max because we have to consume more oxygen to feed more muscles. And so that's why we can achieve a higher VO2 max. In well-trained cyclists, you can see similar VO2 max numbers to their running tests, especially if they're not trained for running. Whereas in triathletes, we tend to still see a higher VO2 max because they were using more muscles.
Oh yeah. Well, that was like the guy that we tested last week was
That was really interesting.
crushing it. Well, it was actually really interesting. We did 2 tests back to back, and one of the persons or one of the individuals tested on bike because they were just concerned about some balance stuff on the or some nausea stuff on the treadmill. And so this was a person that was not used to biking, like very, very fit, healthy individual,
Yeah.
like quite fit individual, but that was not used to biking versus this cyclist. And just how long their test went, what type of wattage they could push was just so drastically different. It was wild watching the cyclist just push 400 watts like it was nothing.
Yeah.
It was crazy. But really looking at this type of testing as a test of physiology, right? Appreciate that you brought up about what are the muscles, what are the mechanics,
Yeah.
because all of that matters, and that's going to be reflected in the breath data. And if we choose a method that is drastically different than what they've been training for, then yeah, often they'll say like, oh man, my legs gave out or my quads gave out. I felt like I could have kept going forever, but I just couldn't push it anymore. And so it gives an idea like, oh, okay, well, it was peripheral fatigue leading to that versus heart and lungs being an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so just knowing that and knowing what you want to target, and again, what's their usual mode of training or what's their sport going to demand.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of the difficulties with lab testing versus what's happening in the sport. Like it can't deal with running and cutting behaviors or team dynamics or things like that, but it can still give us a really good idea of how their body responds to different intensities based on the muscles that are being used, based on the mechanics of the movement.
Yeah. Another interesting case. So we were at a conference last week, Mark and I, and the Health and Fitness Association conference, or HFA. Huge conference, brings people in from all over the world, which was really fun. It was fun to be at. We had a running expert standing next to a test as we were running a bike test. And it was really interesting because this guy got done who was, it was a model that we had hired, and he did the VO2 max test on the Cardio Coach kiosk, and he did a great job. It was awesome. But I believe on his first attempt, he got like a 43 or something.
Something like that. Yeah.
Somewhere in that range. And this guy was like, you should be way higher than that. I was like, hey, who are you to speak up? So he had done a lot of running and running research and things like that, but clearly hadn't done much with bikes. And so it was really interesting to hear him. He's like, you should be way higher than that. Look how fit you are. Look how, like muscular and thin and blah, blah, blah. Like you should be way higher than that. That's not right. That can't be right. You're way higher. And, and so I had to stop him and be like, well, uh, you know, I would agree with you. On the treadmill, he probably would get significantly higher because that's his primary mode of exercise is running. But he pushed himself pretty hard. He got to a true, what I would say was likely a true VO2 max. The difference being with the type of setup we had, the bike we had didn't have baskets or clipless pedals. It just had regular pedals. So he was only able to use quads. So he's only using one muscle set that he doesn't use very much. So in running, 60% of what propels us forward and bears our body weight during running is actually our calf muscles. And so quads actually get used fairly little. I believe it's less than 20% of what bears our weight and propels us forward during running is our quad muscles. I think it's like 15 to 18% or something, if I'm remembering those numbers right. But it's fairly small compared to calf, and then hams and glutes and other things also contribute. But so, all of a sudden he's got relatively untrained quads for cycling, especially. doing massive amount of work all of a sudden that he wasn't used to. And so, yeah, he got a much lower VO2 max on the bike than he probably would have on the treadmill. My guess would be he would be mid 50s or so on the treadmill. Um, if maybe not higher, but at least that. And that just goes to show, like, which is better is a great question. Which is more accurate for him because he's a running athlete would have been a treadmill test. And so, but that's fine. It lets him know for the bike where he's at. And then as he made improvements in his training on the bike, we could see those improvements.
Yeah.
And so it's not bad per se. It's just, is that what we want to look at?
Yeah.
If he's getting into triathlons, and that's great to look at. And it gives us a good baseline and we can see where to go from there. But if he's a runner and we do a bike test, it's not going to give him the information that he needs.
Yeah, which again matters in real world training. And am I getting the results that I'm wanting to? Again, does my training match my goals? And again, I think this goes to the idea of regular retesting and testing on multiple modalities. Because it's not just about VO2 max, right? Like VO2 max is great. It's super important to know that.
Right.
But again, modality, it's not just going to be VO2 max that's going to be different. Thresholds may be different. Your heart rate zones are going to be different. Perceived effort is going to be whenever I do a bike test and my quads are burning, especially if I don't have clips. It's like, oh, this is rough. And so,
yeah,
you want to have that dialed in. And often, even if you're not a triathlete, many people like to use other modalities for cross training, right? It's like, I don't want to just do running. I want to do some cycling or do.
Yeah, that's a great point. That if you're cross training, you're not in the right zones. You could actually be overtraining in your cross training and digging into that recovery bucket too much. And then we're not filling that back up. We're depleting ourselves in our cross training too much for our primary exercise mode.
Yeah. And one thing that we want to do with training is be able to better understand our body's own signals. And so having this anchor of heart rate zones and then learning what that feels like to be in that heart rate zone can be really important. And so if we're doing multiple things, learning what that should feel like for different types of activity, for running, for biking, for whatever, is helpful in helping tune that in. We've talked before about how people tend to exercise in zone 3. That ends up being their selected pace. And so to your point of digging into the recovery bucket, it's like we've dialed in our zones for running perhaps, right? And we've probably slowed people down if they've been doing a lot of zone 3 training, which is pretty typical.
Yeah.
And so now they're putting in effort to do those zone 2 things, but then they go to a different modality and they go back to that kind of self-selected pace because we haven't tested that. Or they use the results of one test to extrapolate to running or whatever, for example. So it's like, well, again, you think you're in your zone 2 range and you're using that same set of heart rate zones, that same heart rate range, but doing a different activity. Like it might not transfer and you might actually be getting up into higher intensities and you're not doing the same signaling for the adaptations that we're looking for in lower intensities, right? Particularly those improvements in fat oxidation and handling, improvements in capillary growth, some of those things. Again, adaptations are not limited to a single zone, but we're looking to optimize certain adaptations in certain zones. And so having an idea of where we should be in different modalities is going to help us dial that in a lot better and avoid putting in volume where we don't want to put volume, right? We already have those adaptations because we've already been exercising there.
Yeah.
And so making sure we're putting our efforts into where we're trying to optimize those adaptations.
Oh, that's such a great point of part of why we don't want to train zone 3 is because most people are already training zone 3. So they already have those adaptations. That's such a great way of phrasing it. It's like, oh, you already did that train. Now let's train zone 4 and 5, where that's going to push your progress forward. And let's build zone 2 so you have a bigger zone 2 so you can go higher into your heart rate range and still have it not be impacting you as much. You'll still preserve zone 3, but you're not going to see progress by doing more training in zone 3.
Yeah.
And theoretically, there's probably an amount of zone 2 base training at which it's like, you're not really getting additional benefit from that. Um, and so doing more higher intensity training would be beneficial.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to some of the episodes that we've had with Daniel Crumbach, where he talked about that's like, this is why we do the VO2 testing. Like, this is why it's so nice to have a cardio coach where we can look at these things and have detailed data analysis. So we can see, oh yeah, like you actually have an amazing aerobic base. We don't need to put, a bunch more volume in zone 2. You really do need those high end adaptations. Or like, oh my gosh, you've done a ton of high intensity. Your VO2 max is high. You have great speed, great power.
Right.
But man, we really need to improve your fat burning oxidative machinery. And so we're going to want to program in more zone 2.
Yeah. So when we spoke at HFA last week, Mark and I gave one of the presentations at HFA. And one of the case examples we used was of a really high level CrossFit athlete that she was doing great. Like her VO2 max was super high. She was quite fit. You could see clearly that she knows how to push herself. She's in great shape.
Great muscle mass.
Great muscle mass, all of those things. So she's doing a lot of things right. But then by not quite spending enough time to build up an aerobic base, she just leaves some results on the table. She possibly fatigues more than she should. And so she's spending an appropriate amount of time in zones 3, 4, 5. And so that part of her training is awesome. And by adding in the zone 2 training, she's just going to increase her overall performance and ability to fuel those muscles higher into her heart rate range with a more sustainable fuel source and all of those great things. And so it's not that she was doing anything wrong per se. It's by adding in this, it's just going to improve her performance and allow her to work harder and smarter and all the things, right? And so much of it is not right or wrong. It's more of let's dial in for what the result is that you actually want and why we love the testing. Like Mark said, with their conversation with Daniel, it's more about dialing in what do I need to get the result that I'm looking for. And that's why testing with the cardio coach really is so powerful, is it allows me to say, here's where I'm at, here's where I want to be, and this is what I need to do to get there. I love that crystal ball effect. I know I've used that term before of like, this is how I have been training, where I'm at, and then what I need to do. And it really does give me that full kind of 360 picture of someone's training.
Yeah. Well, I like that idea of what are they already doing well? I think sometimes there's this thought of when we start measuring people, it's just like, you're doing all these things wrong. You got to train everything. And I think sometimes people are afraid to get the testing because they're just like, oh, well, it's going to be here's all the things you're doing wrong. But it's actually a great way to identify like, oh, this is actually working really well. Look at all the things you're doing right. Like I remember the client that we were talking about, I think we mentioned her on a podcast, like, trying to lose weight, did not have a great VO2 max, but was an amazing fat burner, right? Because she'd been putting in volume at those low intensity efforts. And so I think it's a great way, like this is why the test is so nice, is because it puts us on the same side of the client and we can say like, hey, based on this is what's going well. And if we want to improve things, if we want to optimize, these are some small changes that we'll make, and then we'll retest. And, it's this data-driven process that we can, test, have them apply, take the results of that application, and then see if there's anything we need to adjust, retest, and then do the process iteratively.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I love using the results instead of beating them over the head with it, to instead use it as a way of being on the same side of the table and being like, look, here's all the things you're doing right. And here's some areas where we may be leaving results on the table where we can improve. Because people often say when I show them fat burn zones and start talking about stuff, they're like, so I've been exercising wrong my whole life. I'm like, no, it's not wrong. Like, look how high your VO2 max was, or look how like you know how to suffer at the high end of intensity. And so I like to point out some of the things that they do well to be able to say like, no, it wasn't wrong. Like what you were doing obviously improved your fitness and was good for your heart and lungs and did a lot of great things for you. It may just not have been lined up with what your goals are as much as we would like it to, and hence the testing. And so now we can line those things up a little bit better, and you can have a better result, feel better, be less fatigued, and actually progress toward your goal more efficiently than you were before with lower risk of injury.
Yeah.
And so it's not that what you were doing was wrong. It's just that we can optimize that so that you can have a better result even.
Yeah.
It's like consulting with someone in your business. Obviously you're still in business. So necessarily doing things wrong, but are there better ways so that we can improve profits or whatever that is, making that analogy to other things in life. Like often we're not doing things 100% wrong. Instead, it's more of what are opportunities for doing things even better.
Yeah, yeah. I well, and it's like there are things. So in a car,
Mhm.
right? We'll use this analogy. Driving in a car, if I want to go faster, I can step on the gas, or if I'm putting on the brake, I can take my foot off the brake. And so sometimes the changes that we'll make is like, hey, this will make you go faster. The other things are like, hey, let's take the foot off the brake so that you're not, you know, getting in the way of progress. A way I've heard it described in business is avoiding paying dumb taxes.
Mhm.
And so the nice thing is being able to educate clients on what's happening using the data.
Mhm.
And so this is where we have someone come in where, oh, like I've been doing zone 2 training, right? Like I
Mhm.
got to prescribe, and then we look at what they thought their zone 2 was, and then we can see, visualizing the data, their fat burn, changes in ventilation, everything. Well, actually, what you thought was zone 2 wasn't actually zone 2. It was actually a zone 3 effort.
Yeah.
And here's why.
Well,
Here's the data that shows us why, and here's the data that shows us what to do to correct that. And so it's like it can also help us to just educate clients and bring them up to date on the most current science and the most current evidence. And we don't just have to say like my word against someone else's. It's like, no, this is what your physiology is telling us. This is the story that your physiology is telling us. And then, we get the chance to read it like a crystal ball.
yeah.
Um, but this idea of how do we help push the gas? How do we help pull off the brake and understand people's needs, understand their physiology, understand their constraints, and build a plan that works for them.
Yeah. Well, so when making those determinations, then of like, what's the best way to test? What mode of exercise should we be testing? It really comes back again to test what you intend to measure, but also test them in the thing that they're going to be doing as closely as possible. So when we get that question about, okay, so as closely as possible to real world, what about and that opens up this like whole big set of questions of like, well, what about real world conditions? How applicable then are these results to going out and running in the heat, or how applicable are they to real world conditions? If I go and do this on the treadmill in your lab, what about when I go out and do it out on the street? Is it really going to be the same? And that's one of the reasons why we like to control all of the variables. So we know kind of this is what baseline is. And then we know that, yes, some variables can change, but we know at least what your body's baseline is. And then based on those variables, we expect to see possibly some variations. But by knowing what your heart rate zones are, when things differ out in the field. So let's say on the treadmill test, you were at such and such a pace and your heart rate was X. So let's say you're at a 12-minute mile or a 10-minute mile, 6 miles an hour. You're at a 10-minute mile and your heart rate was 140, for example. And you go out and run on the street and your heart rate is, you're struggling to run a 12-minute mile with your heart rate at 140. Does that mean that the test in the lab was wrong and doesn't really apply to real world? Or does it mean that you had life circumstances? I would argue that it was more about life circumstances. Because when we bring somebody in, we've done this test before where we've had them go out and run at that heart rate zone and then run right in on the treadmill. And we tested them and their fat burn and their like everything lined up perfectly with the test we had done the day or two before. And so that actually would suggest to me that the increase in heart rate compared to the pace, this is why I don't like training for paces, why I train for time and for heart rate is to manage workload better. Um, but what that would suggest is that something about the environment changed. And so that's why the pace compared to the heart rate changed. But we still want to honor the heart rate because that's the better measure of workload than pace is. Pace is a great measure of the conditions of the day when we compare it to heart rate. So it could have been that the temperature was higher. It could have been that you had been more stressed out or poor sleep or all kinds of other factors. And so that's why we like to get a baseline devoid of those factors so that we can see what under perfect conditions your body looks like so that we can then troubleshoot and say, what are the confounding factors so that we can adjust if possible. And if not, if we can't adjust for the heat, then we know that we're just going to be slower today.
Yeah. But heart rate really is just a great measure of it's very responsive to workload. It's very responsive to stressors.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons that we track it. And so like Cameron mentioned, I go out and usually, so this has happened to you many times. Well, this has happened to both of us many times, right? You go out, do an effort, and like usually when I go at this time of day and at this, speed or pace, like my heart rate is solidly in here. And today, oh my gosh, I'm just walking or I'm just cycling at a really low clip and it's so much higher than normal.
Totally.
And so, yeah, that's a good indicator of, okay, like something's up. What's changed? Is stress higher? Did I get poor sleep the night before? Right? Is there extra humidity in the environment? Those things.
So many factors.
Yeah.
So many factors that can play into it.
But using the heart rate zones as an anchor, but then taking in those other variables, considering things like my rating of perceived exertion, right? Zone 2, usually is kind of like a 3 to 4 out of 10 ever. So you can kind of track it, zone 1, 1 to 2 effort, zone 2, 3 to 4, zone 3, 5 to 6, 7 to 8, 9 to 10.
Yep.
Tracks pretty well on heart rate zones, roughly. And so we're using the heart rate zones as an anchor. We're bringing in like that rating of perceived exertion so we can dial in like, oh, does this effort feel way harder than usual? Or does it feel way easier, right? Can I go faster today at the same heart rate range? And sometimes we'll have that happen too. And so it ends up being a form of auto regulation. So instead of just, oh, my training calendar says that I've got to do at this pace for this long, it's like, okay, you know what? Today I'm just not feeling it. I'm going to respect that heart rate zone. I'm going to stay there. And then tomorrow, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. I slept amazing. I'm refreshed. Like, oh, I can actually push it a little bit harder today and I feel okay about that.
Yeah.
And so just using those signals as ways to adjust the training, but still looking at them as anchors. Because what we're looking for in a test, as we're looking at the ventilation data, as we're looking at fat versus carbohydrate, it's helping us to get an idea of how the body is responding to different intensities.
Yeah.
And so when we're going out, like even if it does, the conditions in the real world don't exactly match the lab, if I'm going at a similar intensity, then I'm going to be selecting for similar adaptations, right? So the low, slow training, right? Our low intensity training is geared more towards engaging type 1 muscle fibers, right? They're highly oxidative. And so that's going to help with building that machinery. And just the long duration is going to be kind of repeated low level signaling for certain adaptations like improved capillarization, increase in blood volume, changes to the structure of the heart, increases in oxidative enzymes, improvements in burning fat. Because we're going at that intensity, even if everything doesn't exactly match the lab, like we're still going to be selecting for those adaptations because we're going there. Same thing with high intensities across the range of heart rate zones. When we're going at those intensities, when we're pushing that, and again, our heart rate is very responsive to stressors, such that like if there's a bunch of external stressors, that can change the relative intensity. And so listening to our heart rate, using that to guide things, coupling that with things like RPE can just help us to keep training effective in the real world and make sure that we're actually getting the adaptations that we want to be getting.
So along those lines, another question that we get all the time is, what about eating? Right? So if we standardize everything, what normally my baseline is to eat something right before I go out on my morning run. How do we handle that? Do we want people to do that? Do we want them to have eaten beforehand? And again, I think it's a test what you intend to measure thing. So often I like to get a baseline of them having not eaten so we can control that.
Yeah.
Because most of the time people don't eat the exact same thing every day.
Right.
So race day, a lot of times people will have like their standard, this is what I eat before a race. And so I have done tests like that where I've said, okay, if that's your race day meal, then let's have you come in and test. having had that race day meal and see how that affects him. What we find with most of the time with eating is it can affect the test, especially early on. But after a warm up, and if we do kind of a slower ramp up test anyway, you kind of knock that blood sugar back down and then things get back to normal. But the first few minutes of the test definitely can be affected, and especially if you don't do much of a warm up. But when we get it back into steady state, um, things tend to normalize a bit. But it is an interesting consideration depending on what you're training for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think one thing to look at is short-term effects versus long-term adaptations.
That's a huge, yep.
And considering that, like, that can change the conversation quite a bit because like, this is kind of an aside point, but people have this argument of should I do fasted versus fed training?
Right. I mean, I always have my breakfast and my coffee before, so shouldn't we test that way so that we can see?
Yeah.
It's like, well, that would help us test a short-term effect of having that food and that coffee.
Yeah.
Sure.
But where so many variables, like, I actually tend to eat the same breakfasts because I'm weird and it's easy for me, but I will often eat it at different times of day. Sometimes it's like 8 in the morning, sometimes it's 11, and so I don't always have a set thing, and so I might even exercise at different times of the day, right? I don't always exercise at the exact time of day. Throughout the year, it's like we have 4 seasons in Utah, and so I go outside and I train, at the same time even, having eaten the same meal, but it's different conditions. And so again, getting a good baseline just helps us to have a better starting point from which to make those inferences. And then this is part of why we do retesting regularly is okay, I've been training in this domain. Is this having the intended effects that I'm wanting to? When we retest, is my zone 2 expanding, or is my VO2 max getting higher, or is my way that I handle fat and carbs changing in the direction that I want it to? If not, okay, well, that gives us some good data. What do we need to tweak? That's where questions come up. Well, okay, tell me about, some of these other things. Tell me about what your training has looked like. Like, let's see your training logs.
Yeah.
And
Well, so yeah, exactly. Because there are variations from day to day, comparing maybe two tests where we were fasted versus fed, or two different tests where we were fed versus fed. We had somebody actually recently send us in a bunch of results of like, hey, I was comparing the cardio coach to a different device, and here's the protocol that I used, and he even shared what his breakfast was, and his breakfast was different from day one to day two, and so it was like, well, that one was like more steak and eggs or well, eggs and bacon and so higher fat, higher protein versus
sounds
oatmeal.
delicious right now, by the way.
Yeah. Versus oatmeal. And it was like, well, those are going to have completely different effects. And in a 12-minute long test that he did, you're not going to see, that's not long enough to see that the carbohydrate from a big oatmeal breakfast burn off. And so you know, those are the types of things. So, like Mark said, we want to see over time what the change in adaptation is from repeated training. And so, for a lab test, unless our goal is to see how they respond under oatmeal or under whatever, which is a totally valid way of
Yeah.
testing. Like, if you want to do a series of tests where it's like, okay, now let's have you eat this, and then the next day we'll have you eat this, and we'll run some tests to see the differences in your metabolic profile. Like, I think that would be a really fun thing to do with an athlete. But if we're trying to track trends and get accurate heart rate baseline zones, testing in a fasted state is going to be best, where we control as many of the variables as we can so that we can see, did this variable change because of training adaptation and not because of what I ate for breakfast that morning.
Yeah. Well, and our bodies are just really good at doing what they do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we adapt to the environment that we're placed in. And so it's sometimes I think we have the thing that's like, oh man, I'm just going to confuse my body. It's not going to know what to do with this. I'm adding in food. It's like our bodies are really good at switching fuels. In our current food environment, that's actually not quite the case anymore. Historically, um, we were better at kind of switching between fuels depending on the intensity, right? Better metabolic flexibility. Um, but like when we give our bodies specific uh, stimuli, they're really good at making adaptations according to those stimuli. So again, like what does my training regime not look like just in an individual day, but over the course of weeks, months, or years, and those signals are going to drive adaptations. Because the training is one side of it, but then the recovery is another side of it, right? The only training that matters is training you can recover from, is what we always say. And so, um, I think just it's a valid question, day to day changes and eating, um, but I think it maybe is zoomed in a little bit too much on the individual day versus like let's zoom out and look at, are we trending in the direction that we want to? If not, we can take a closer look at things.
Well, and I think it again is, if we want to test those conditions to see, that's great, but I don't think that supplants the fasted, rested, uncaffeinated test.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
What?
I think all the baselines, or all of the variables controlled test is one we have to get. And then testing myriad ways in under differing conditions can help dial things in, and I think is great.
Yeah. But also with like when we're wanting to look at trends over time, it's important that we standardize those tests so that when we've had a training block and we go back and retest, like you said earlier, we're comparing apples to apples. It's not wildly different tests, wildly different protocols. And so we can draw better inferences tracking those two tests over time versus if we're just always testing something different every time.
Right. It's harder to make inference. It's harder to make kind of training decisions based on that. And it's one of the reasons why we don't like or don't prefer field testing. You'll see a lot of the wearables um, that allow people to do field testing, and that is a great snapshot of, if you trust the results is another question altogether on the accuracy of wearable devices. Um, but it's a great snapshot of that day under those conditions doing that training. But if you're doing speed and agility work and have the mask on, is that really applicable to what they would be doing during an actual, if you've got a whole soccer team doing that and wearing the mask while they're doing their speed and agility workouts, does that really look like what it would look like if they were playing in an actual game, where it's not maybe quite as steady, where it's more stops and starts, and there's just a lot of considerations there when you're doing a field test. Of it really is just a snapshot of that moment and not anything that we can really extrapolate that out for making broader inferences.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to what we talked about earlier of this practical framework for testing, we'll just review those again one on one. And so before testing, you want to ask, what am I actually trying to measure? Again, is it
That's the big one.
VO2 max? Is it zones? Is it fat max? Is it fatigue resistance? What am I actually trying to measure? What mode does this person actually train in? And trying to match that as close as we can. What am I going to use the result for?
Yeah. What are their goals?
Yeah.
What are they training to accomplish? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is it performance? Is it general health, general fitness? Is it longevity? That's going to somewhat change the training regime. How can they perform the test safely and competently?
Super important.
And then back to what we were just talking about, how repeatable can I make the setup? How can I standardize it in such a way that those comparisons test to test are valid comparisons?
Yeah.
And so we're really trying to separate the signal from the noise and make that testing as clean as possible. And so, yeah, we really just want to be able to find, I guess, whatever we're testing, right? We typically talk about zone testing more, but whatever it is we're testing of those different types of, you can run kind of anything that you can imagine on the equipment, right? Looking at different things, but just you want to make sure that the testing is going to give you clarity on the variable that you're looking for.
Right. That we're actually getting that specificity of, this is what we're trying to measure.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. This is mostly unrelated, but I remembered it as you're talking a little earlier. So there are debates about fasted versus fed training, which is better for a variety of adaptations. And what it seems to come down to in the literature is what works for you, right? Do you like to train fasted? Do you feel better when you train fasted? Or do you feel better with some food in you? Like, go based on that. When we look at fat loss, there isn't a difference long-term between people who train fasted versus people who train fed. Again, fat oxidation does not equal fat loss. It's, have I had a calorie deficit over time? And so there may be like some small differences in adaptations over time. Maybe that matters more for the elite athlete, but for the average person,
and the risk of self-sabotage can be high depending on the type of workout. And then females need to take in consideration cycle timing and things like that. During certain phases of the cycle, it can throw off hormones, it can throw off recovery and things like that. Exercising fasted, especially in higher intensity workouts. And for anybody in their higher intensity workouts, it's probably less of a good idea versus the long, slow base training when you're trying to burn, be in your fat burn zone to do that, to be fasted anyway can be fine. But for a well-trained runner, I try to recommend if it's over about 10 miles or over anything beyond like hour and a half, probably fed is better than fasted.
Especially if you haven't been training without.
Yeah. And so it just depends on the effort level. I think there's a lot of considerations there. But to go do a sprint workout without having glycogen on board, you're probably going to not be able to perform as well as if you did have some glycogen on board.
Yeah.
And so you want to do as many reps, as many cycles as you can at a high level to get those high level adaptations. And if we're bonking because we just didn't have the energy because we're training fasted for track workout, then we're not getting as many high level reps. We can't push as hard as often to drive as much adaptation. And so that's where I would argue a lot of that has to do with what the workout is, the workout intensity is, what the workout duration is. And so light intensity, short to moderate duration, I think we're fine to be more fasted, especially if for women, if that's within parts of their cycle where they're not like right before their period. It's right before and during period. That's a phase where we need more in terms of recovery, in terms of, we don't want to deplete the system too much, or it can have hormonal implications and throw things off for a bit. And so that's lots to consider there when considering fasted versus fed.
Yeah. A great resource, this is just another aside, for just general training for women is Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. So she has really good evidence-based information on training, particularly for women, and confronting a lot of the common myths that are out there about how women should train. So she's a great resource. Check her out. But yeah, again, this is making sure that your training matches your goals.
Yeah.
And we're not self-sabotaging. And the truth is, most of us are rarely in a fasted state,
Right.
in a true fasted state. And so we often have, especially in those shorter efforts, have plenty of glycogen on board. But yeah, so just making those considerations. Again, I loved how you put that. What's the intensity? What's the duration? Are there some other considerations? What do I have conditions that affect that, right? Do I have hypoglycemia or something?
Did I get a bad night's sleep?
Yeah.
Did I, things that can, other factors that can make your performance poor. And it's like, maybe I do need just a few calories on board. And that's another consideration to think about is the number of grams of carbs that we need to fuel a workout is actually much lower than what people would think.
Yeah.
It's actually a fairly small amount. And so,
yeah, that's such a good point.
Yeah, we don't necessarily need to dive fully into that for these purposes today. Maybe that's a good topic for a future call. But look into some of that research and we'll talk about that. But I do think that often we eat more than we think. We eat more than we actually need for performance.
There you go. That's a nugget to chew on for everyone.
Well, that's a teaser.
Oh, well, awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today. As always, remember, if you want more content like this, remember to like, follow, and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Ready to take your metabolic testing to the next level? Visit KORR.com to learn more about purchasing our metabolic test equipment.